Good morning, Anahi.
Good morning.
How's the week's discussion looking for us?
So today we're going to talk about how we think about money, how we manage our money, and how we can keep more of our money.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, we're doing more money, more problems.
Yes.
Well, thinking about money, I think we all think about money, but I
Yes.
assume you had a specific line of inquiry here.
Yes. So obviously money is a good thing. But I think over time I am starting to observe like the psychological effect that money has on people. I think it's more, I'm starting to see how it's more of like how trends and how like the market and how big numbers or small numbers affect people. It's more of how comfortable they are in the state that they are at. I'm starting to see how a lot of the financial decisions that people make are more based on emotions rather than like logic. I think it's interesting to see how people are like, or how they perceive the monetary value and how they interpret it in their own way. And so I kind of wanted to connect this with what I'm doing with my course. I learned about the illusion of control, which is basically believing that you can control like future outcomes when you really can't. And then conservatism bias, which occurs when people don't update something or don't change something when they know that something new is happening. And then lastly, just like a general thing, which is something that we always talk about, is trading money different right now than what it would have been in the future. So meaning that it's not that like a dollar today isn't the same value as it is in the future. So I kind of wanted to see your input in this. I'm just curious to know like your view in this, I guess.
I don't know that I have a view. There's a part of this conversation where I have a view, but I think in all the topics you just listed off, these are all behavioral finance constructs or psychology of money, financial psychology constructs. I guess to maybe push back on the structure of the question, there you say like, what is your view on that? These are all things that exist, much as the same as the sky is blue and gravity exists.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you ask me about my view, what is it that you wonder or contemplate that I might either maybe agree with or disagree with as you look at these things?
I guess first of all, you've been doing this for a long time, so I'm just interested to see like what are some trends that you see with people? What are some things that you've been noticing over time, or like when you started, how did this affect plans? How did this affect how you worked with people?
Mm-hmm. I think, and you gave examples. You didn't, nor could you have the time to list off like every possible example of financial psychology constructs or biases or heuristics or any of that. So not holding you accountable by any means for not like spending 40 minutes listing off every possible thing. I think what's interesting is that you see certain commonalities in certain populations, and at the same time, you also notice that there is no immunity, sort of in the same way that like disease doesn't really know class. Anybody can have diabetes, anybody can suffer from heart disease, anybody can have a family history of mental illness, all sorts of things like that. Financial biases are more or less prevalent in certain communities and in certain populations. But as financial planners, we tend to see a sort of a more limited band of them. We can still see some of them less frequently. But typically, when somebody becomes a client of a financial planner, often, not always, but often they have overcome quite a few of these biases and heuristics sufficient to build the income or the affluence to then find themselves in a position to want or need a financial planner. So all this to come back to your question of what trends do you see? I see less financial biases and problems in clients than I see in the general population. That is not to say that if you are a client of a financial planner, that is somehow curative, right? It's not, you don't hire us and suddenly all your biases disappear. And that's not to say we don't have our own biases as financial planners. But I think what I observe observe often is that, these biases, these heuristics, these financial issues, in a psychological sense, often are more prevalent in groups that are then struggling financially, whether that's from debt, whether that's from income, job insecurity, family, financial challenges, all sorts of things. And I think generally speaking, but not always, I think the population of those doing well financially have either avoided or otherwise mastered or overcome more financial biases than the population at large.
So I think it's interesting that you say that like what you mentioned about like diseases, they don't differentiate between classes. I think that was a very interesting part that you talked about a while back, and I thought that was interesting. But I guess kind of following that, for people who I guess grew up very differently, in the sense that like they grew up with like a survival mode or something like that, and eventually like a car accident happens or something very unlikely happens and they receive like a big amount of money. How does that affect the plan again, I guess? How much do you take that into consideration when it comes to like a person who didn't grow up with money and all of a sudden they have like $800,000 in their bank account now? Do you work, I guess, with their like psychological like emotional feelings with the money, or I guess how does that affect everything?
So first and foremost, this is actually a really interesting area in the subject of finance as a whole, both just from like a raw technical financial planning standpoint. But there's actually even something called the Sudden Money Institute, which is a training and education organization for financial planners, so for financial professionals to gain more skills and techniques and whatnot to work with people who experience a sudden windfall. The funny thing is if you ask the question in a vacuum, right? If on day one you had no money and on day two you had a lot of money, would you be any worse off? The interesting answer is that you actually could be worse off. Not mathematically speaking, right? You have more money, great. Yeah. More money, good. Less money, bad. Yep. In like the most raw, simplistic form. But we have to really take into account the driving event for where this money came from. You give an example. Maybe you're in a car accident. Okay, are you receiving this money as part of a settlement or a judgment? And this money is helping replace an enormous amount of loss. Did you lose a loved one in that accident? Were you physically injured or disabled? How has this affected your quality of life for the preceding months or years? And what does this money, this form of justice, whether it's restorative or punitive, what does that do to you? Right? It's one thing to sort of have this idea that one day this accident, this this event is going to be made right. It's very different to receive whatever numerical measurement of justice you finally received through this process. And in turn, what if it's inheritance, right? What if a family member had to pass away or a friend had to pass away for you to receive this? And you might go like, well, of course you'd be sad. Well, maybe you are inheriting money from a family member who abused you as a child. Maybe you didn't have a good relationship with this person, or maybe the money is coming to you through a trust or something like that, where the trust came with some terms and conditions you don't really approve of or you're not happy about. So sudden money is something that is a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge for a lot of people. Even something as simple as winning the lottery. You're like, well, okay, there's no guilt or emotional baggage with winning the lottery, right? But we have an enormous amount of evidence that a lot of lottery winners end up just as broke as they started, because they use this finite resource, potentially enormous resource, right? Millions of dollars, even hundreds of millions of dollars to solve the problems, the financial problems of their life or their family or their community. But then eventually they're presented with decisions they don't want to make. You have a family member who you gave money, you've helped out, and they don't use it very responsibly or intelligently. And now they're coming back to you asking you for more money, and you say like, I'm not comfortable with that, or I think you wasted it last time, or I don't like what you're going to use it for, so I'm not going to help you. And then suddenly your relationship is harmed because they look at you as a bottomless abundance, right? And you're just being selfish or greedy, or you're not helping them, and that makes you a bad person in their eyes, even though you just didn't. It's not about the money; it's that you didn't want to enable or support this thing that they were asking you for. So all that to say, From a psychological standpoint, sudden money windfall events can be enormously burdensome, enormously challenging for people, whether they had a lot of money to begin with or not. From a technical financial planning standpoint, I have a much more simple answer here, which is, all of our clients, or a good number of our clients, are anticipating some sort of windfall, right? They, just generally speaking, a lot of our clients had at least, one well-off family member, right? Mom, dad, they were raised in a decent, a strong household. Maybe only one member of a couple, right? One spouse has, money coming to them. Maybe the other one doesn't. There's all sorts of psychological dynamics there. But all of this to say, we generally ignore the possibility of any sort of inheritance or windfall until such time that it actually occurs. We don't ignore it for purposes of conversation or discourse, but when we build financial plans, we tend to orient ourselves to try to build a financial plan that will not depend upon this sudden money event later in life to be successful, because we can't control whether it will or will not happen. And so we want to make sure we build plans that will succeed with or without that particular variable.
Yeah, I think weighing off the difference between making that big amount of money from like a lottery or just out of luck or something that you didn't have to lose in order to get, or having to get into an accident to get that money, I think that also depends a lot. That would also have a huge effect on like the way that you perceive that money. Because if you're losing a family member, it's like, well, I lost the family member, but now I have $1 million. So I think that's, I don't know, it's nice having more money, but having to balance off what you're losing to get that money would have a lot of like strain, like mental strain with that. So that's interesting.
There's a thought experiment that I quite enjoy on this subject, which is taking even the loss out of it and just talking about what money can and can't buy. And so here's the basic thought experiment. Would you, Anahi, or anybody listening to this, trade places with Warren Buffett? So you get his money, you get his wealth, you get his connections, you get everything, but also you're almost 100 years old. Would you trade places?
No.
And that's an interesting thing, because we intuitively understand that even though Warren Buffett is one of the most financially successful people of all time, that no amount of financial success, wealth, or affluence can replace the fact that he probably, and I wish him a longer, happier, healthier life, but that just generally speaking, he is probably not going to be around that long. And that every day is becoming more and more precious just based on where he is in his life expectancy. And so that's sort of a thing where we can say, okay, in a vacuum, more money is always good, less money is always bad. But when you account for what the trade-offs are, there's plenty of things that we would trade money for and rather have, right? We'd rather have, our family pet back. We'd rather have our mom, dad, or dad back, our sibling, our best friend, whatever could lead to us. Money can't buy those things. And so that's something where money, for all of its potential, right, for all of its value, for all the permission it gives us, sometimes can be a emotionally burdensome and even sometimes destructive force in our lives.
A lot of people talk about like money can't buy happiness. Like, for example, I grew up not in the most affluent like household, so like money was happiness for us. So we perceived it that way, but then like you started putting everything into perspective where it's like, yeah, a lot more money is better, but then you don't spend time with family. You're working a lot more, but then you're missing out on good things that could be happening around if you were around. So I think that's also like a mindset that's been shifting over time, and a lot of people have a different perspective on that, where like money is happiness, but then you have the money and it's completely different than what you thought it would be. So I think that's just also very interesting. And then I guess like on the contrary side of that, I kind of wanted to talk about debt, or like things that people push off for later on, where they say that like, where they don't have the money in the moment. And so they try to get all of these things that they don't have, and they try to push that into the future. Kind of with the mentality of saying, when I make more, I'll worry about that later on. What is something that you think that quietly sabotages people with having that mindset?
I think I can zoom out from your question a little bit because I think there's a good framing here that helps us understand what that behavior does. So when I get to the point of answering your question more directly, I think this will be helpful.
Yes.
So there's an abiding theory called the behavioral life cycle hypothesis that essentially tries to explain human behavior over a lifespan with respect to like, why do some people spend so much money on credit cards? Why do people go into debt that they probably will never be able to pay back? Why do people make these sort of, again, in a vacuum, suboptimal financial decisions? Now, you can come up with, anecdotal examples. Right? You get into a car accident, you don't have health insurance. Suddenly you owe a hospital $200,000 for fixing your leg and doing MRIs and whatnot. We're not really talking about that. We're really talking about deliberate consumption decisions over a lifetime. And what the hypothesis suggests is that people have sort of a intrinsic quality of life figure. And it can change over time. But like you and Anahi have sort of an implicit, internalized understanding of what you can and can't afford and what your lifestyle is and is allowed to be and is reasonable for you. And the trick is that your income, right, based on your job, based on your cost of living, your lifestyle, current events, sometimes your income isn't adequate to support that, right? Where you make a certain amount of money every year, and though you would generally not overspend, occasionally something could arise. You're going to buy a house that you can barely afford. You need to buy a new car. You don't have, a good water heater or furnace, and it goes out in your home, and now you've got to, pay $20,000 that you really just didn't quite budget for to do it. All of this is attributed then to sort of this idea that what people do financially over a lifetime is they go through what we call consumption smoothing. And to just make up numbers to make that easy to follow, if your quality of life and your lifestyle is roughly approximated to, let's say, $80,000 a year, and your income is, let's say, $90,000 a year, so that's affordable for you, then you have this nice $10,000 savings margin built into your situation. But you could go through intermittent periods where either your income drops, you quit, you lose your job, you change careers, so you move across the country, something changes, whatever, and your either income drops, or some life event happens and your expenses increase, where suddenly your income is less than your expenses. And to account for your mental framework of what your lifestyle is supposed to be, you are willing to engage in financially suboptimal behaviors like borrowing, right? Spending money on a credit card, that sort of thing, to smooth over that, recognizing that by doing so, you'll have to spend future dollars to make up the difference. So when you talk about how do people make mistakes here, or like why do people do these suboptimal behaviors? It's that human brains are really good at rationalizing present need and discounting future costs in so doing, right? We're willing to make short-term financial compromises that we can't reasonably afford or shouldn't do because we find ourselves less convinced of the harms in the future relative to the value we would receive by engaging these compromises in the short term. And this shows up in particular in things like retirement savings. A lot of people just mathematically do not save adequately for retirement. And you can tell them that, and you can show them the math. You can say, look, based on every dollar you're not saving right now, you're causing yourself a bigger and bigger and bigger problem in the future. So you should do something about that. And people will be like, you're right, I absolutely should. And then they don't. And it's not because they don't logically or rationally understand that problem. It's that they have a hard time empathizing with their future self and their future needs.
So what about for people who think or have the mentality of like, we don't know if we're going to be here tomorrow? How does that come into effect? Because like I know that a lot of people are like, well, who knows if we're going to be here tomorrow? Who knows if we're going to be here in a year from now? So they don't, for example, for like retirement, a lot of people don't care about their retirement or even think about their retirement plans until like mid-30s, 40s, later on. When you could be starting at an early age, like in in your 20s, when you're starting like entry level and stuff like that. Like, what about for those people who think that way?
So everything is sort of a frame of probability and discounting from probability. And what I mean by that is, let's take a really extreme example to highlight the process people are going through here. We have had, as a firm, and I have had as a financial planner, more than one conversation during different current events, economic conditions, political events, administrations, but over a decade plus, I've had plenty of conversations with clients on both ends of a political spectrum and different parts of society that essentially go something like this. I think we are heading for the end days. I think the apocalypse is coming, right? That guy got into office and we are going to hell in a handbasket, as soon as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And my question then will then be, okay, so let's assume you are possibly correct, right? On a scale of anywhere from it's never going to happen 0% to it's guaranteed to happen 100%. How much of your life and your affluence, your career, your money, your income, how much are you willing to commit of your present resources and until the event happens, your future resources towards the eventuality that you believe could occur here? Now, if you think that the apocalypse is coming 100% chance, in the next year, the world will end, nuclear war will happen, whatever, and you believe that 100%, I don't mean like you're very certain, I mean you are 100% certain, there is no reason you would do anything other than deploy every available resource you have towards preparing for that apocalypse, right? You would be selling your house, building a bunker somewhere out, 20 feet underground, buying as much survival gear, fuel generators, food, water, all of it as you possibly could. I've never had a client do that. Now, in turn, right, if we then take that extreme and discount down from that and say, okay, like, I think it's very probable. What does very probable mean? I don't know. There's like a 1 in 4 chance the world's going to end. Okay.
Very low.
Very, very low. But if I say we'll flip a coin twice, and if it comes up heads both times, the world ends. You're not going to like the results.
Yes.
But in that sense, it becomes okay. If you're 1/4% certain, then should we not go ahead and reasonably indulge that possibility? Let's hedge that risk. Let's buy some non-perishable food. Let's get a backup generator. Let's maybe, be a little bit more cautious with our resources. Most people are discounting at like a 3% probability or 2% probability. They'll have some like water in their basement and maybe some like a bucket of non-perishable food.
Toilet paper?
Some toilet paper. But like most people aren't moving out into a bunker in the woods.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the point here when we think then about the less extreme version of this, but the, tomorrow is uncertain and today isn't promised and so on and so forth. Well, okay. You can do that on any given day, right? Like I don't fund my 401k literally every day, but I do it consistently over time on the anticipation that I will live to a ripe old age. And if I do, at some point, I will need money to live on when I stop working. And there's, again, just a discounting right here. I Dan Yerger, am 100% certain beyond the uncontrollable probability that I get hit by a bus or come down with a terminal illness, that I will get old otherwise and that I will need money to live on. And so I behave in accordance with that. It's the opposite extreme that's problematic, where people say like, well, tomorrow's uncertain. Well, tomorrow's uncertain. Well, tomorrow's uncertain. Okay. But you're not living most of your life that way, right? You just happen to be neglecting certain key parts like saving for retirement, saving for your kids' college, building an emergency fund, saving up for whatever it is. You're neglecting it on this tiny incremental basis, but you're also not living like you're going to drop dead tomorrow. So again, this is just a discount rate problem where people are overvaluing the possibility that today is the last day of their lives and undervaluing the very strong probability that they will still be here in years or decades.
And then that kind of connects with my next topic, a question that I had for people who do want to budget accordingly and they are planning to live old and wrinkly and till the very end.
Some of us age well. I won't age well. I'm already not aging well.
Good for you.
Some people are going to look great when they're old, though.
Yes. Well, for people who are planning to live the long life, I was doing my research in preparation for this podcast. I came across an Investopedia article, where it said that around 67% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So if that's the case now, when depending on solely the next check, how do you create a budget accordingly? I know about the 50-30-20 savings rule that I have, but with that being the case, where like there's a lot of people who are living paycheck to paycheck, how do they still plan accordingly for their future?
I think more there's a whole thing where I could say like, well, you just get on a spreadsheet and you do math and you carve it up. You do 50% needs, 30% wants, 20% savings. I don't think that solves the core problem. And the core problem here is, for many people, not everybody, I'll put the caveat out here. Some people just do not make enough money, period, right? Like their income is just too low to do anything practical here. So I'm going to carve those people out of my answer, because the only answer there is you need more income, period. And if you can't get more income, then you've got to find some way to reduce your expenses or defray your expenses. So carving out, and I hate to say it, that's going to be 40-50% of the population. There's a huge number of people who do not have enough income to meet their needs, let alone wants or future things. So I'm really looking at this, call it the top 17% of your 67%, and saying, okay, you're at the median of the population, or you're at the average of the population, and you're on the right side of the bell curve. You need to be more critical in prioritizing what you can afford versus what you want. There's a certain school of thought in personal finance, like a Ramit Sethi thought, which is cut ruthlessly things you don't want and spend luxuriously on the things you do want. But I think a lot of people eyeball the wrong things here, right? You get the example of like the latte effect. If you just stop buying coffee and never bought Starbucks again, you'd be a millionaire. Yeah, but that's not really going to be the driver of your financial success or not. The bigger issues are going to be something like, hey, I'm a young 20-something single person fresh out of school. I got my first $50,000, $60,000 a year job, and I immediately must move into an apartment on my own. I can't have roommates. I got to have my own apartment, and I got to adopt that dog I always wanted, and I'm going to get myself a new car. Okay.
That sounds a little personal.
Well, I speak from some experience here, but this is an American norm.
Yeah.
You hear about kids like moving back in with mom and dad after school or something like that. But a ton of people get their first job out of school and immediately absorb every dollar into their lifestyle. And so something like having, let's say, $1,500 a month rent on your own versus splitting rent with somebody else and spending $800 a month on rent, $100 more for a 2-bedroom versus $1,500 for the 1-bedroom, that difference in spending is almost a 50% marginal difference. And that $600, $700, $800 difference in that random example could be the difference between having an emergency fund and not having an emergency fund. Same thing with buying the new car, or even a relatively expensive used car versus just driving whatever car you already had into the ground. Same thing with buying a pet. Like I have 3 dogs, 2 cats, and an axolotl. I got pets. I just spent over $100 last night dealing with a cat that got too much insulin. Like I've spent a stupid amount of money on pets. But you accept, same as adopting a child. When you adopt a pet, you accept responsibility for its care and its needs. And so, getting even, let's say, just a dog is a couple $1,000 commitment every year, most likely. Getting a cat, couple hundred, if not over $1,000 commitment every year. And all this stuff adds up to a baseline of the definition of need that sometimes is excessive. Where we say, I need an apartment. I need to live on my own. I need a car to get to work. I need a pet to be my companion that I love and care for. And that all could be very true, but a lot of that also is more want. I don't want to share an apartment. I don't want to drive an older car. I don't want to not have that beautiful golden doodle that I got from the breeder for $5,000. All of that adds up in a way that makes the budgeting exercise difficult. And so I think it is, if you are, I used to guest lecture at a community college here in town. And I would go in the personal finance class, and I would say to all the 18, 19-year-old kids in the class, I'd say, you all have a superpower right now, which is you all get by just fine without very much money. And the problem is, as soon as you get a paycheck, you're suddenly going to find that your tastes get way more expensive than they were a week prior. If you can maintain any ability of discipline to keep your expenses as low as they have been up to this point, when you didn't have a full-time job and salary to support yourselves, do that for a year or 2, because that could give you enough to build the emergency fund to get yourself above the threshold of living paycheck to paycheck. And that really is the trick, is when you go from one level of income and make a significant step up, whether it's your first job, whether it's your first big promotion, whatever it is, if you can maintain the discipline to not absorb that difference into your lifestyle and save and pocket some of that alone is going to set you miles ahead of a lot of people.
I think when you realize that you actually have a more expensive taste than what you realized beforehand, I think that was like a very like rude awakening thing once I started receiving like a full-time check, because it was all up to me to buy what I wanted to buy. And then my mom was like, "See, you used to ask for all of these things, and now it's coming out of your paycheck, and now you don't want to buy it." So it's interesting to see the difference between like when you think something is not as expensive and then it comes from your paycheck. And so kind of following that, once like a early 20-year-old person has like a good stable job, have a full like I guess they're getting paid good, basically a good amount relatively to their spendings. How do you know what to fund first, once you're starting to build up your life after that, as opposed to somebody who already has a family and is like nearing their 30s, early 30s? What's the difference there? What do you prioritize funding first, and then the following steps after that?
Assuming that there's no like major debt problems or complicating variables, right? So we're not talking about like a family that has $80,000 in credit card debt or something like that. We could assume people have a mortgage or they're paying rent, anything like that. Basic answer here is, I like to say that we favor what's called a reverse budgeting approach, which is we don't need to say that we can only spend $200 on this and $300 on that, so on and so forth. The best thing to do is to go through the prioritization activity and put your needs and your savings first, and then do with the remainder whatever you like. So when we think about that, we're saying you've got to pay your mortgage, you've got to pay your utilities, you've got to pay for your insurance, you've got to pay for your groceries, and you've got to fund your 401k or contribute to the pension, or if you don't have one of those, you've got to put money aside for your own retirement. You have to do that. How much, right? When we get into the savings conversation, that sometimes become the how do you prioritize conversation, right? Do I put money into my 401k? Do I save for my kids' college? Do I save for a new car? Sometimes necessity is going to drive shorter term behaviors. But when you start getting into things that are not solely about your own needs and maintenance, that's where some of the it depends really starts to creep in. For example, and this is not a unique or original observation on my part, but the classic example that a lot of families, and when I say a lot, millions of families have gone through in the United States, is parents who self-sacrifice their future financial welfare to provide for their children in the short term. And when I say that, I don't mean something as basic as like groceries and clothes, but I'm saying, they will sign their kids up for the summer camp. They will pay to put them into expensive travel sports leagues. They will pay for them to go to college or borrow money to help put their kids through college. And they will not save adequately for their own needs. They won't have an emergency fund. They won't build up their retirement. They won't do any of that. And that's all an act of love. It really is, right? Like I don't think parents are shoveling money out for their kids' benefits because they don't like their kids, or because they hate themselves. They just care about their kids more than they care about themselves. The problem is, eventually, you are creating a bigger problem for your children by doing that. So in the example of saying, I'm going to send my kid to the most expensive summer camps and the best, piano lessons and the sports league, and I'm going to pay for their college, I'll borrow all the money, and I'll figure my own retirement and my own savings out later. The problem with that is that you have less time. Your kids, by definition, have more time, right? So it's not great for kids to have student loans and not pay for their college, but they have a whole lifetime to get that paid off and to work through that problem. And they are the sole beneficiary, generally speaking, of the education they incurred those costs for. In turn, if you financially self-sabotage too much for other reasons, whether it's for your kids or whether it's just because you're just sort of, I'll figure it out later, it's a future me problem, right? Back to the whole, tomorrow's not promised thing. The problem is at some point you will become somebody else's problem, right? If you are the parent who is 75 who can't work anymore, right? Their health has declined enough that they really just can't make a living, who only has Social Security and does not have any savings to live on, right? Who maybe still has a mortgage or a house that's not paid off that they can no longer afford, you are going to become a burden to your family or your community or somebody else. Somebody else is going to do it. And the challenge here is, again, student loans suck. Not getting to go to the Taylor Swift concert sucks. Not getting to go to summer camp sucks. But you know what sucks more? telling your kid just as they're getting to the age of, having their own family, raising their own children,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I hope you really enjoyed summer camp when you were 9.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I have no money and I'm going to have to move into your house. And you not only have to, house me, but you also have to pay for my food, my utilities. And at some point, as my health declines further,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to need you to step away from your responsibilities at work or your kids
Mm-hmm.
to start doing things as simple as helping me dress,
Mm-hmm.
helping me take a shower, helping me eat food. All of that is a huge burden on children. And it's not always intentional. Sometimes it's just back to never having enough money to do anything about it, or enough income to do anything about it. But that type of behavior where we say, like, how do we prioritize? Really coming back to your question,
Mm-hmm.
we need to think about not just the short-term benefits, but the long-term consequences of the decisions and trade-offs we make.
So cutting the fun money.
Well, it's, again, not about cutting the fun money necessarily, but doing the responsible things first and enjoying the remainder.
Yeah. So how would you still prioritize? I don't know. I mean, it all comes down to that same logic where you have to prioritize what you want, and what's most important to you before you start doing everything else. But for somebody who's starting again, how do they prioritize? I think I admire the fact that you really care about people's vacations and how when they're gonna go spend time with their family and stuff. Just caring more about their happiness and their well-being and the comfortableness that it comes with that. How do you? Is that just something that you always plan to build into their savings, or build into? Is that something that you advocate for?
Ideally. I think one of the things that biases your perspective of that, and I appreciate the compliment, but we as financial planners typically work with people who are dealing with financial abundance more than financial scarcity. When you look across our client base and our client roster, you don't see people on food stamps or SNAP or WIC or any of that stuff. We have 1 or 2 clients who are I'll say enjoying Medicaid, not necessarily because they're poor, but because of great tax planning. But generally speaking, right, most of our clients have a substantial amount of affluence. And so you get to see me look at them and say, you have enough, or you're doing well enough, or you've already done all the responsible stuff.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what you do with the extra. And that's a fun conversation to have. And that gives you the impression that that's very important to me. And it is very important to me because that's a big part of why our clients come work with us. But when you expand out to a larger population of people closer to the average income or median area income, or you go down into lower income folks, then unfortunately a lot of that stuff falls by the wayside. It's rent or doing the thing you want, right? It's groceries or having that video game, right? And those are really tough trade-offs for people to make sometimes. And I'm very sympathetic because I, at one point in my life, was one of those people who really didn't have much money to speak of and really was playing trade-offs with every financial decision. So I understand it and I get it. But I bring all this to say, there's a curve of happiness and a curve of adequacy to income. There are certain levels of income that are simply not adequate, period. It doesn't mean you'll die, but you can't have any version of thriving at certain levels of income or absent income with the absence of assets. In turn, when those problems are solved for, when you're paying your bills, you're saving adequately for retirement, when your kids are going to be well taken care of, maybe not perfectly taken care of, but they're going to be fine. Once you've met all those necessity items, then you can turn your attention to what makes life more worth living, right? Those things that you want to enjoy rather than that you have to do. Money is permission. And sometimes we have way more permission than we need, and some people don't have any permission at all.
And so you mentioned the clients who are using Medicare or taking Medicare as part of tax planning. That's also something that I've been noticing. I guess before all of the information that I'm getting now and everything that I'm seeing, I used to think of taxes as you file them before April 15th, you either pay or you get a refund. And that's as far as I got, I guess. But I think it's interesting to see how people are using taxes as either something that they are planning for or something that they should be expecting so that they don't get much of a hit once they actually file their taxes. I know that a lot of people can be saving what they have to pay to taxes if they simply knew how to plan accordingly for taxes. Because moral of the story, you can't escape taxes. So one way or another, like, they'll show up. So I guess one of the questions that I had, or I guess comment, more of an interesting thing for me. What is something that you think a lot of people miss when filing taxes that causes them a liability? And then when people make a quote unquote mistake on taxes, thinking that they can get out of paying taxes, do you think it's just curious? Do people actually get fined? Do people actually go to jail for that?
I mean, a lot of people pay fines and penalties for underpayment or failure to pay. I think I'll go to the first part of your question though, which is, how do people do this, or what mistakes they're making. I think the most common mistake is not a mistake that like costs you money in a serious sense. It's not a mistake in which you fail to pay and you get caught later or something like that. I think it's honestly a failure to double check your assumptions. So here's the example, right? Most people in the US are W-2 employees. They work for a company. The company has payroll software. Payroll software handles whatever they're owed in terms of hourly wages or salary or something like that. And they get a check. And many people fail to assess the costs or ramifications of what it means for their paycheck to be wrong, in the sense of, hey, I am assuming that my paycheck is just right. I'm assuming that based on the inputs in the payroll software that it's withholding an adequate amount and doing enough for me that I should be fine. But the fact of the matter is, many people, right, do not actually have the adequate amounts being withheld from their paycheck, or sometimes conversely have way too much being withheld from their paycheck, where they're giving this tax-free loan to Uncle Sam. So in that context, the thing that really stands out to me is that many people just sort of let taxes happen. And then in the course of letting things happen, they go ahead and just see what happens in the spring. And they feel like they have really no control or power over it. They're either, oh, I got a refund, great, free money, except it was always your money. And you're just getting your money back that you never owed any in the first place. Or you owe money and you go, well, gosh, how did this happen? There's nothing I can do about it. So first answer is just challenging your assumptions and not just assuming that your payroll, your wages, your withholding, all that stuff is correct. Double check that things are correct, because I've seen clients who were paying income tax to the wrong state. I've seen clients who just didn't have anything withheld. The payroll software was just ignoring their need to pay taxes, or the wrong box got checked or something. So there's just a lot of things like that where I think you just want to look at your inputs first and foremost and just challenge the assumption that they must be right because somebody else is giving you those numbers.
That kind of brought up an idea, or like a thought that I had a little bit ago. There was like a trend going on TikTok where people would turn off their tax withholdings, and in the short term perspective, yes, you're getting all of your full complete paycheck, so everything looks beautiful, like not a lot is getting taken out from your paychecks, but like in the moment, once you actually file your taxes, there comes a huge bill. Is there really a difference between paying all of your taxes throughout the year with your checks and then paying, or either that or paying them all in one once you file your taxes?
If there's a tax liability, there is definitely a difference. So there's a certain level of income where essentially you don't pay taxes. And in fact, between your lack of need to pay taxes because of deduction reasons, and then also certain grant, credit, deduction benefits. With all of that in mind, there is a scenario where somebody essentially doesn't owe taxes. And so it doesn't really matter whether they have them withheld from paychecks or not. With the exception of payroll taxes, there's no exception from that realistically. So if you work wages, you're going to have some amount of taxes. You might still get more credits and deductions back such that you end up with more money than you paid in. But there's a world where that's kind of the big outlier issue. Otherwise, or the exception that has to be accounted for in that context is that, as you go through the process of thinking about, am I going to be better off or worse off? If you have a tax liability, short answer, yes, you are going to be worse off if you just don't pay your taxes throughout the year. Not only because you are required to, So the whole TikTok trend of just like upping your W-4s that you just don't have any taxes withheld, you're committing fraud. Like you when you fill out a W-4, it says very clearly, I certify under penalty of perjury to the best of my knowledge that this is reasonable and accurate in representation of my tax situation. So you're committing a crime. Number one. Is that a regularly prosecuted crime? No, it's sort of diminished. It's a threat without a lot of follow through. But if you got caught, right, if you got audited and they really pushed you, if you did this for significant amounts of money or significant amounts of taxes, then you would have to explain to an auditor, well, here are my W-4s, and I know I certified under penalty of perjury that this is all reasonable and true, and it's clearly not. So that's its own problem. But even ignoring the potential criminal penalties or things like that, there are penalties and interest due for underpayment. And so if you just wait until the end of every single year, wait for the spring and see what you owe, it's going to be what you would have owed anyway, plus interest and penalties. So that's sort of the issue here, where the taxes you're going to owe are always going to be the taxes you're going to owe. You can do things like put more money into pre-tax retirement accounts. You can do things like deferred compensation and various things that change your tax picture. But all things being equal on the input side, there's no difference between the taxes you're going to owe paying all the way through the year versus at the end of the year. The tax number is the same. It's then just a difference of penalties because you didn't pay.
So if it's, I guess, breaking the law, why do companies allow that? Or is that even true? Can people even do that? I just saw the trend.
The bigger thing here is that it's not that companies aren't responsible for your representations, because you, the employee, are filing the paperwork with HR saying, I certify under penalty. Now, is a smart HR person going to look at a W-4 that says I have 600 dependents and therefore I don't need to pay taxes up to an enormous amount of income? I'm going to look at you and be like, explain to me how you have 600 dependents. They should do that, but they're not legally obligated to necessarily. I'm sure that somebody with a sufficient motivation could try to pursue a company and say that they were systematically negligent in permitting this to go through or something. But just generally speaking, it's not the company's responsibility. You, the employer, are telling the employer under penalty of perjury that that's an accurate representation of your situation. And so that is the bigger challenge here, is not so much whether companies should or shouldn't let people do it, so much as whether they are obligated to do something about it, which generally they are not obligated.
Oh, they just won't do it.
Well, it's not even that they won't do it. It's just that, look, if you tell me you can either intervene and that could expose you to liability, or you can do nothing and your liability is much less, my rational risk-adjusted decision as the employer is to do nothing. Why intervene and potentially cause a problem? Again, I think there's a legal answer here. There's what your lawyer would tell you, and there's a practical, like, just doing the right thing answer here. And those are not quite synced up perfectly.
Yeah, makes sense. And then something else that I always thought was a huge moving piece, and Daniel kind of talked me through this. I thought that the more you made over time, you would have to owe back more of that amount. So as income goes up, liability also comes up. That's kind of how I always thought about taxes. And so it's kind of interesting to see how people who are making, or who are like high earners, still are getting a refund. So what are the things that kind of help them still even get a refund? Or it might just be something that I'm not, like, I don't have that, like, background in, but that's just, like, something that I always thought. And is income even a huge moving piece that affects taxes and how much you're getting back?
It is. I think what you're describing is we need to remove this getting back part from it, because that actually doesn't matter. The getting back is simply, did you overpay? And or are you eligible for certain refundable tax credits that are increasing what you get back or offsetting what you owe? So I'll give you a good example. There have been federal and state incentives for buying electric vehicles, and that often took the form of a tax credit. But the trick was, in most, if not all cases, it was not a refundable tax credit, meaning it would reduce your taxes owed if you owed taxes, but if you didn't owe taxes, if you were going to get a refund anyway, you didn't get any benefit from the credit, because it was non-refundable. So it was a scenario where, and I'm just going to make up numbers here, right? If your tax credit was $3,000 and you happen to owe $3,000 in taxes, then you wouldn't owe taxes. Great. But if you owed $0 in taxes, you would not get $3,000 back because it was non-refundable. The problem you're highlighting with your thinking though about, if you make more income, your liability increases. It does. Dollar for dollar, the more money you make, the more your tax liability will increase. But it's marginal. It's not a cliff. So you sometimes hear I made too much money and I would have made more money if I hadn't made so much money.
Yeah.
That's essentially never the case.
Okay.
There are, and I say a handful, truly a handful, a tiny number of federal and state tax incentives and so on that are treated as cliffs as opposed to gradients. But most tax measures are gradients where if you go past a certain line, the benefit doesn't just disappear. It just starts to disappear incrementally. And so it eventually goes away. So something where, I'd have a tax credit on this, but if I make more than $150,000, then it starts to taper away. And by the time I make $250,000, it goes away. And so net for 150 of income versus 250, there's maybe a $6,000 benefit somewhere in there that evaporated as I made another $100,000. But basic logic here, would I rather make $100,000 and lose a $6,000 benefit, or would I rather have a $6,000 benefit and not make $100,000? So there's very few cliffs. There's a couple cliffs out there. Here in Colorado, if you make more than $300,000, your state level tax deduction goes to almost zero. And so you are in Colorado better off making $299,999 than $300,000.
Oh.
But that's a rare cliff in the tax code, and you don't find those very often.
Kind of an interesting. What's a interesting deduction that you don't hear much about or see?
At least in our practice, and this just has to do with our client base. This doesn't mean it's any rarer or more or less common. We don't see a lot of clergy deductions and special rules, and we don't see a lot of tribal rights or tribal permissions or privileges in our practice. And that just comes down to the fact that we don't have any members of clergy in our client base, and that we don't, to my knowledge, have anybody who's eligible for Native American, tax treatment or special exemptions. There are some planners out there and some firms out there that all their clients are clergy, or all their clients, or a large number of their clients are eligible for those. So it's just rare in our particular case or instance. The other thing that we don't see a lot of in our practice is international stuff. All of our clients are U.S. domestic, generally speaking. So we don't really deal with a lot of international tax claiming credits or exemptions or expat stuff. Again, there are other financial planning firms out there that deal with that stuff all the time. Otherwise, a lot of tax programs and incentives exist at the corporate level as opposed to the individual level. And those are really designed to try to drive, the economy and innovation and whatnot in a certain directions. We give certain tax incentives for startups and tech companies and whatnot to try to incentivize them to make the next great thing.
Well, I personally haven't heard about those. So that is, I was trying to see different types of deductibles that people, but as far as interesting it went, it was you can deduct your desk or your home office, stuff like that. But I didn't get much into those. I'll definitely look more into those, and I think those are very interesting. And I mean, I'm just interested to learn more about those and how those affect people's taxes. How, I don't know. I think it's just interesting to see how taxes can literally tell you everything. You can say it. They literally tell somebody's life in a piece of paper, basically.
I really wish it was a piece of paper as far as the length, but a lot of tax returns 100 pages long.
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of it's an interesting thing because there's a lot of people in the financial services world that will, sell investments, sell insurance, and never look at a tax return. We don't prep taxes here, right? We don't suffer from tax season the same way our good friends in the accounting and enrolled agent world do. But on the other side of that, as a financial planner, to me, it is absolute negligence to try to advise somebody about their finances without first reviewing their historical taxes and without giving them advice that is sensitive and cognizant of their future taxes. That's why, even though we don't do tax return prep or anything like that, we ask every client for their tax returns every year before they become a client, when they're clients, and we review them every year, not only for accuracy and just trying to find any mistakes or errors, but also because the tax return is generally a strong representation of their financial concerns and considerations. And this will sound funny to some people, but we have clients all the time who just forget to tell us about stuff. You're like, oh yeah, we get oil royalties.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I own 1/12 of a cabin in upper Vermont. Like, there's weird stuff like that people forget about all the time, because to them it's like this tiny, not front of mind thing, but it fits into their financial picture, and that, you know, those little things can aggregate up to being big impacts on the overall financial model.
Yeah, you can literally find everything. There's where like some of the plans that I've been working on, when we're doing like either data reviews or prepping. Some of the things that we find in their taxes, they think that things that people haven't mentioned at all before. And so I just think it's interesting to see like a tax document have little things that people don't, even like you said, like it's so small to them that it doesn't even get brought up into conversation.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think a fun one we found out recently is a new client had a famous family member, and to this day, they and their siblings and cousins all receive some kind of income and royalties from the stuff that this family member did well before any of them were alive. So I do think it's just sort of funny, right? That you know, they would never think of it as being a big part of their financial picture, but shows up in the tax return.
Yeah, everything shows up in the tax return.
So Anahi, as we wrap up here, and as we always like to ask, what do you think you learned about in the past week that's sort of interesting or unique for our audience to hear about?
So this previous week, I learned about DST, so a Delaware Statutory Trust. I learned that they're similar to a real estate investment trust or REIT, but can serve as means to complete a 1031 exchange and defer capital gains taxes on similar real estate that you owned before and don't want directly to either manage it or own anymore. Maybe you're tired of getting like the phone calls in the middle of the night of people saying the toilet isn't working, the light bulb is not turning on, and stuff like that. So it's basically a way to invest in a tangible real estate without having to deal with that property management side of things. So instead of buying an entire property yourself, you and other investors pay a part in, and another management company would come in and basically handle everything else, like the conversations with the tenants. A lot of people use a DST when they are in the process of selling property, and it basically avoids paying a big tax bill right away.
Yeah, and you know, to differentiate or establish here, right? You can buy a REIT, a real estate investment trust, and just be invested in real estate. That's easy. Or you could invest in real estate oriented publicly traded companies. But the idea here for listeners is, you know, if you had a rental property and you're tired of being a landlord, you can sell your share, transfer it in with the original cost basis on that into this DST. And then very similarly to something like a mutual fund or a REIT, now you're a shareholder in this investment product that in turn uses your investment dollars to invest in, you know, whether it's single family housing, apartment complexes, commercial property, that sort of stuff. So yeah, they're sort of a niche product. They are not a first stop for most investors, but particularly for investors who have really appreciated real estate or really depreciated real estate where their cost basis is almost zero or is literally zero, and selling would rack up a huge capital gains bill. It's a really nice way to kind of keep your dollars invested, but go from concentration in one or two tangible assets to a more diversified portfolio of those types of tangible assets, but without, as you call it, right, the risk of getting a call at 2 a.m. about the plumbing. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.